Well, on the traditional Christian liturgical calendar, this is indeed the first Sunday of Advent. And in case you haven't noticed, there isn't much about unity that you could really call traditional Christian. That's one of the things about unity. We have a little different vision, but Unity World Headquarters every year at this time, they put out an Advent booklet, actually, in addition to the Daily Word. They put out this booklet especially for Advent, that contains readings and poetry and meditations and things like that. And the overarching theme that they chose this year for the Advent booklet is hope. Hope. So, hence the topic today, Beyond Hope. With a little luck, in about 15 minutes, you'll know what I mean by that. So even though we don't consider ourselves to be traditional in many different ways, we know that these traditions, these customs, are part of our culture. These are traditions which, for better or worse, have shaped the world that we live in today. And usually during Advent, the focus is on Christmas stories in the Bible. Even though we don't take those stories literally, it can be interesting and productive to explore how they do indeed continue to shape human consciousness today. You know, I can't think of too many other things in history that have had a larger or a more lasting impact on the world than these different stories. Now, of course, if Jesus were around today, I don't think he'd have a clue about what we're up to with all of this stuff that goes on at Christmas. The fact that Christmas has become this multi-billion-dollar global industry, it wouldn't impress him much, especially considering all of the things that he had to say about money and accumulation of wealth and things like that. But one thing I don't think he'd be upset about. I don't think he'd be upset about people saying Happy Holidays instead of Merry Christmas, because he didn't have that kind of ego. He never set out to create a religion with him at the center called Christianity. Jesus was not a Christian. He was 100% Jewish, and he saw the world through the lens of the Jewish scriptures, especially the prophets. History had not been kind to the Jewish people, and in the face of dark times, they often looked to the writings of their prophets to give them hope. And I know we often think about these prophets and we see them as being these doom and gloom scolds who waggle their finger in your face and things like that, the kind of people that didn't get invited to many holiday parties because they always wanted to talk about politics and stuff like that. But there were also prophets who we might consider as early versions of life coaches, right? What are life coaches trying to do? They're trying to give you practical suggestions and motivation on how to attain your goals. So these prophets were trying to motivate and guide the Israelites in how to attain their goals. A few years ago, in connection with a Bible class I was teaching, I came up with this timeline, which I think should be up here next. There it is. Basically a timeline of Jewish history from the time of Moses in the Promised Land, all the way over there on the left end, up to the time of the Romans, right at the time when Jesus was born. Yeah, some of you have spotted the oy vey up there. In connection with the Romans, because that was not a happy time for the Jewish people. And in fact, as you can probably tell from this graph, well, first of all, it's divided into red and green. Nice Christmas colors, right? But there's a deeper symbolism to it. The red basically means stop. Red can mean war. Red are the times when there is basically strife and disharmony. They're either fighting with their neighbors or under the control of some occupying force. And of course, green is the green light, the happy times, the good times when they enjoyed independence. Pretty easy to see from this graph, right, that the red times greatly outnumber the green times. That's kind of the way it was for the Jewish people. And at the time that Jesus came along, they were under Roman occupation, a very bad time. And yet, despite all the red that we see up there, the prophets promised the Israelites that the bad times wouldn't last. That if they were just patient and faithful, and above all, follow the law, they had to follow the rules. If they did this, then God was going to send a great leader. Someone who would take them back to the glory days of the empire of Israel, probably under King David, that kind of thing. And of course, this great leader was known to them as the Messiah. Messiah means anointed one. The word Christ is the Greek translation of Messiah, simply means anointed one, the great leader that was to come. There was just one problem. These prophets were notoriously vague about who this Messiah would be and just exactly what this person was going to do. You read some of the different passages in the books of ancient Hebrew prophecy, and this person seemed to be a warrior king who was going to vanquish the enemies of Israel and make them into a superpower again. Other passages described him as being this priestly figure, this wise, holy person who was going to bring peace and prosperity. So, what was it going to be? A kingdom of material prosperity and power, or one of justice and peace? Well, maybe they could have both, but either way, they expected this Messiah to be a fixer. Someone who was going to change things for them, for the better. And this gave them some hope during very dark times, which I think is probably why one of the themes that we find on Advent Sundays is hope, and why Unity chose the overarching theme of hope for this Advent. Hope is an interesting thing. There's a couple of different ways we can look at it. First, there's the cynical version. Do I have the cynical definition up here? Hope, an emotional belief in a positive outcome despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Pretty cynical. Karen and I had a guest instructor back when we were at Unity Institute who once said that if he had his way, he'd get rid of the word hope. And the reason he wanted to get rid of the word hope is because he defined it this way, that it was an emotional belief in a positive outcome despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. In other words, we would use hope as a way to try to avoid facing reality. And the illustration that he used for this was, he said, hope is a person who is falling off a 90-story skyscraper. And as he's falling, at each floor they can hear him saying, "So far, so good. So far, so good." Well, okay, he's entitled to his opinion. I heard that and I thought, well, that sure beats the heck out of screaming all the way down. I have to say I like the idea of hope, even if it does seem a bit unrealistic, because I figure that anything that's going to help to keep me calm and focused is going to increase whatever slim chance there might be of a good result. I want to give myself the best odds possible, and if a little hope is going to keep me calm and focused, bring it on. Think about the alternative, right? When someone says that a situation is hopeless, another word we might use for it is a desperate situation. Desperate comes from the word despair. Since when has that ever been a good thing? So when we look at it that way, I think hope is good. It's powerful. Some of you might recall a movie from a few years back called The Hunger Games. Remember that movie? Hope was a major theme in that movie. The movie was set in a country that's manipulated and controlled by fear. And the president of this country, his name is Snow, President Snow, actually a dictator. He understands the power of hope and the threat that it poses to control by fear. Here's what he said. He said, "Hope, it is the only thing stronger than fear. A little hope is effective. A lot of hope is dangerous. A spark is fine as long as it's contained. Hope is the only thing greater than fear." Now, he's the villain, but he speaks the truth. He knows human nature. A little bit of hope is fine. A lot of it can actually be more powerful than controlled by fear, which is why they would want to contain it. And this spark of hope, just a little spark, it can come from the most unlikely source. Now you remember in the movie, the source of hope was a 17-year-old girl. Her name was Katniss Everdeen. And she had some serious skills. She was an expert bow hunter, but nobody expected her to lead this eventual revolution that would topple President Snow. Nobody thought that would happen. And I think in a similar way, Jesus was probably the most unlikely Messiah that you could imagine. You don't have to be a lifelong Bible scholar to read these stories and see that the deck was definitely stacked against him. Number one, he was an illegitimate child. Number two, the family home was in a place called Nazareth, and a place that was so obscure or perhaps infamous that in the stories one of Jesus' own followers was later quoted as saying, "How can anything good possibly come from Nazareth?" Think about this. He wasn't born into a wealthy or powerful family. You read the story from Luke, they were too poor and unconnected to be able to find housing. So Jesus, he's born like a homeless person on the street in a more or less makeshift shelter. And instead of engaging in a lot of political intrigue or teaching people how to fight or raising an army, he said things like, "Turn the other cheek. Give them the shirt off your back." Things like that. Hope needs to be a flexible thing. When someone suggests in the stories that Jesus might be the Messiah, well, the Jewish people, the common people say, "No way. He's a nobody. Not flashy enough." The priests and the Pharisees say, "No way, because he doesn't follow the law. He heals people even on the Sabbath. He dines with sinners. He feeds the poor. Forget him. He's too liberal." And then there were those who, instead of saying "no way," said, "Why not? Why not?" After all, it was the politicians, the king, the Pharisees, the generals that got us into this mess that we're in right now. And this guy is talking about something different. He's talking about something, why not someone? Why not someone just like us who understands what it's like to walk in our sandals, who doesn't think that the answer to every problem is violence or revenge? You know, it was like a light bulb turning on. Someone like us. Instead of waiting for this superhuman fixer to come along, maybe we just need to follow the example of this wise and courageous teacher. And gosh, maybe we should take responsibility for our own liberation. Not with outer violence and revolution, of course, but by this inner shift, this different way of thinking, this change in consciousness, this renewed focus on life-affirming ideas that placed everyone on an equal footing in terms of human dignity and value. That was kind of new. I think if I was going to summarize the meaning of Advent, it would be stop waiting and get on with it. Don't wait for it, create it. That's essentially, I think, what Jesus was saying in the gospel. Stop waiting for someone to come along and do all the things that are in your own power to accomplish right now. All you have to do is change the way you think. You heard it was said, an eye for an eye. I say to you, another way of doing things. You think you have to kill your enemies? I'm telling you to love them. You think that every time someone does you wrong, you have to get revenge? I'm telling you to forgive them. You think there isn't enough to go around? I'm telling you that if you give, it will be given to you, full measure, pressed down, overflowing, and things like that. So hope isn't about waiting. It's about knowing and trusting that the situation and the solution is within our grasp, that we have already been given everything that we need to begin that process of liberation. All we have to do is to deal with the habitual ways of thinking that I think, as we see, are not working very well. And nobody can do that for us, not even Jesus. And it requires a great deal of courage. I would suggest the courage of a warrior and the heart of a hero to do that, because when we change the way we think about the world, it often goes against the grain. People don't like it. There is resistance. There is reaction. I think maybe the reason why these different stories that we're tracking during the Advent season, the reason they have such staying power is because they marked one of those important turning points in human history, this important turning point in evolution, where we looked at the world a different way, where people started to realize something that, well, I'm just going to read this quote. This is summed up by Unity author Eric Butterworth. This is from his book, Discover the Power Within You. They became aware, they evolved to the point where this became part of human consciousness. He says that civilizations have never been destroyed by outer conquest or divine fiat. Civilizations have risen and fallen by the rise and fall of human consciousness. The fall of Rome, for instance, was an inside job. If humankind is in trouble today, it's not because of the wrath of God, but because of the darkness in the minds of men. The kingdom of heaven is still within man, and the mind that was in Christ Jesus is in every one of us. That's what finally dawned on human consciousness. You know, the most common meaning of the word Advent that we've touched on already is the arrival of a notable person, thing, or event. And what I think we're seeing in our Christmas stories is the arrival of this idea that was embodied in a person that's taken the world a long, long time to understand it and to actually liberate the idea from the person. We have to liberate the idea from the confines of that one religion that calls itself Christian and liberate it from the confines of that one person whose name happened to be Jesus. You know, there are many people in traditional Christianity who really and truly believe that Jesus is literally going to be coming again, and he must come again because he didn't, dare I say it, finish the job the first time. I think they're totally missing the point. You see, the second coming is when we finally get it. It's when we finally get it. That's, you know, when we finally get it, when that darkness of mind, Eric Butterworth talked about that darkness of mind that's the core of all our problems. When we finally get it, it means that that darkness of mind has finally been illuminated by that greater truth, the revolutionary things that Jesus would talk about. So, maybe that's why Advent starts with the lighting of a candle. A reminder of how instead of, how is it they say, instead of cursing the darkness, it's better to light one little candle. Instead of cursing the darkness, we need to bring the light. So what we're waiting for is here. We need to bring it into the light. Happy Hanukkah, everyone. See you next week.